Hey everybody, what's up? It's David Ariev here yet again for Eyedesyn.com, coming to you with a very special Octane tutorial today. We're going to be creating happy trees and calming patches of grass and art directing scenes of beautiful digital nature. And yes, we are going to be creating God rays. I'm going to be endowing you with the power to create God rays. I'll let you decide what that means for yourself. Let's check it out. So I saw all the cool kids on Instagram making all these digital nature renders, and at one point I decided to have a play with it myself since Octane Scatter and Forester makes it super easy to do that. These are some of the first images I made with it using my default space guy sitting there in the field with his pretty little flower. And in retrospect, I don't really like how some of these came out because the grass looks way too clumpy and there's like too much variation in the color. You can see the individual patches of grass, which looks pretty weird to me. Like maybe you could sell it as an alien planet, which I kind of did with these Lorax tree looking weird things. So here's another one. And then I went off and did this documentary project involving a bunch of Octane Scatter to create these forest environments and these mountains. And this is actually pretty lazy work because it's just one tree scattered several million times, and it just goes to show how much you can get away with this technique. And then I did this ridiculous KFC job, and again, this is just one wheat plant scattered several million times with some noise in the distribution to create those patches that you see. And I've also got the shaders dialed in so that it looks like light is passing through the leaves or the pieces of wheat, and that totally sells the nature a lot more. And the other day I was playing around with creating some more Instagram renders, and I think I got to a much better result that now includes a bunch of volumetrics, and you can see I've got the God rays in there that are really helping to sell the natural environment. And I'll just flip through some of these, and you can also see that I've got some glossy reflections on these leaves as well as transmission to let light pass through. So the shaders matter a ton. And God rays are basically just shadows cast by the sun into an atmosphere or into some volumetrics of some sort. And here I'm playing with more of a stark look that I kind of liked. And just to give you a little more context and get you even more pumped for this tutorial, let's look at a few of my favorites on Instagram. For instance, here we've got Joseph Bashara, who I think is just one of the best at creating these natural digital environments. And he has this like very nicely spaced grass. If you compare to some of those previous renders that I did, I think he's dialed it in even more. And you can see there's like all these nice little rocks poking through and this kind of curly wispy grass that I really love. Like I love this here where he creates areas where you just see the sticks and twigs and dirt, and then other areas where it's grass covered, and it's not just one type of grass. We've got other longer pieces of grass poking through, and he's got ivy on the wall, which we won't get into, but I definitely recommend looking at the Ivy Grower plugin, which is a free plugin for Cinema 4D. And here we've got Philip Hodas, or Hoodas, as I'm sure many of you know. He makes some beautifully intricate scenes, a lot of the time with popular video game characters or, Bender from Futurama, that kind of thing. And here you can clearly see those same kind of glossy highlights with light passing through the leaves as well. And of course, who could forget my buddy Beeple? He just goes and makes the grass all pink and crazy like he does. And here we can see that Forester also has some amazing wind simulation capabilities that you should definitely check out. And finally, my buddy Alex Ness, who helped advise me on the shaders for this tutorial. And you can also see here that God rays don't necessarily have to be the sun casting the light. Any small light source can create God rays. They're essentially just shadows in a volume. So here's another good example. If you've got a light beaming through some kind of object like trees, you can create these streaks of light and shadow, and that's basically the principle behind God rays. And so what I briefly mentioned earlier is this plugin from 3dquakers.com called Forester. It's just the best plugin for nature in Cinema 4D. So you're going to want to get this if you want to follow along exactly with me, but you can use anything from the content browser to these packs from Laubwerk. And there's also this great site called VisPark with really detailed models of real shrubs, real flowers, and they also have real trees and real grass. So any of those packs will work great. But with Forester, you've got the control of these procedurally generated trees, and so it can be very useful for really customizing the plants that you're using. It's also worth mentioning that SpeedTree is an incredibly powerful program. If you want to go super crazy with your digital nature stuff, this is where you should go, because you can customize even more about the tree, including the roots, and there's just even better wind animation and stuff like that. I used to use this program and it's great, but the fact that Forester is built directly into Cinema 4D makes it even more attractive for working quickly and working directly with handing geometry off to Octane. Alright, let's just start off by checking out a few trees inside of Forester and building some shaders for them. So I'll come up here to Plugins, Forester, and grab a Forester tree. And let's just throw down a floor for the time being and set this rendering in Octane, and then throw down a daylight. And I'll rotate that until it's a bit more of an angle that lets us check out the shaders. So if we come into Forester tree here, we can go to the tree library and choose something as a really good base to start with. Let's just start with this beech tree here. So here's our fancy tree, and you can see these are physical render materials, so we want to convert these to Octane materials. So let's grab both of these, go to Materials, Convert Materials, and then we'll go to Materials, Remove Unused Materials. So now we're just using Octane materials. Now if you see this happen where they've blanked out, you can double click them, and if you double click this image here, it'll refresh. So I'll go also to the trunk here and double click this, and now we've got our pretty pictures back. Alright, so the first thing that should be obvious is that we don't have any leaves on this tree. So if we go up to our beech tree here, and under tree parameters, we can see that there are viewport levels and render levels. This should be pretty familiar for a lot of things inside Cinema 4D, but it's just a little gotcha that in the viewport we're only seeing 3 levels of detail, but in the render we're seeing 5. So if we were to send this to picture viewer, we would see a lot more detail and more branches and more leaves and all that stuff. But I like to see my final result in this IPR here. So let's set the viewport levels to the same levels as the render levels. And this will take a second to update. So there we go, we've got some nice leaves on the tree and lots of detail in here, so you can zoom all the way up and see the individual textures on these leaves. But we're never going to be that close, so it doesn't really matter a ton. This could be a green color and it wouldn't change the look all that much. So the first thing I want to show you is the difference between using direct lighting here and path tracing. So right now I'm in direct lighting, so I can go to Compare, Store Render Buffer, and then I'm going to switch over to path tracing, and you can see this already helps out the look of the tree a ton. We're getting a lot more bounce light into those leaves, and it's looking a lot more lush. So I'm going to stick with path tracing for the rest of this tutorial, but the main thing I want to change in my settings is setting GI clamp to 1. This should really be the default in Octane, is 1 or less. And that really helps clean up fireflies and a lot of issues you get with path tracing. Alright, so the first super easy thing we can do to improve our leaf shader here is by just going into this node editor. I'm going to give myself a little bit more real estate, and all we have to do is take our image texture and pipe it into the transmission slot. And let me undo that so we can see the difference here. So this is before. I'll go Compare, Store Render Buffer, and then pop this into transmission, and you can see now we've got light actually coming through the leaves, and it's looking a ton prettier and much more like actual vegetation. And if we want, we could boost this a little bit further. Let me just come in here a little bit, and I'll go Store Render Buffer yet again, and we can put a color correction in here, and we could change the gamma just slightly. And so if we bring this down, this is a little bit too much, but you can see as you bring it down, it kind of boosts the light that's coming through a bit more. So you don't want to bring it too far or you'll just flatten everything out, but it's a helpful control to have. So let's go somewhere around 0.7 or 0.8. And again, props to Joseph Bashara and Alex Ness for helping me out with the shaders on these leaves. Alright, so let's back out, and I'm going to change this around a bit so I can navigate a bit better. So this is great for most of the angles that we're going to have our sunlight, but one issue is that when we've got the sun beaming directly down onto this tree, you expect to see some kind of glossiness or waxy leaf coating going on here. And we're not picking up any of those highlights. It just feels like a completely diffuse material, which it is. It's completely diffuse. So let's blend in a glossy material to try and fix that. So we can just take this entire setup here and hold down Control and duplicate it. And then let's grab a mixed material, and let's pipe both of these into material 1 and material 2. And then this second one, we're just going to change the material type to glossy. And so we're not going to see any of this until we actually drag the mixed material over top of the previous material. And so we can see what we're doing. Let's just shift this slider all the way down to the glossy material. So let's try to figure out which of those this is. This looks like our transmission material from before, and if we go all the way this way, we've lost that transmission. So I'm guessing this is the glossy material, but we're not seeing any of that gloss. We're seeing some little fireflies, which are bad. So let's check this out. First off, we can double click this node to get rid of it because we don't have transmission in the glossy slot. And let's push a little bit in so we can see what's going on a bit better. Alright, so if you look over here, we've got this extremely tight specular highlight, and that's why we're only getting these little fireflies in here and not really seeing the overall glossy component come through. So if we come over to the roughness, then we can crank that up and we should start to see something happening. So let's compare store render buffer and go back to where we were before, and you can see now we're getting some glossy highlights showing up. And it's a little bit subtle at the moment, but this will change a lot depending on the intensity of the sun, the angle of the camera, and some other things. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's bring this back up to, I don't know, 0.8, 0.9. Turn off our compare mode here. And then let's just take our daylight and bring it up so we can control it a little bit better and rotate it around. And so depending on the angle of this sunlight, we should see more or less highlights. See, here we're getting it a lot stronger, so that's a little bit more clear. And now we want to blend between the two because we also want to see our transmission. So typically I just go with around a 50% blend, and now we're getting light coming through the trees and we're getting these more intense highlights. And also if I drop in an Octane camera, look through the camera, enable the camera imager, and choose like a different profile, like something that's a little bit contrastier. Let's flip through these. I mean, you can see some of these are really extreme. For instance, if I go to one of my Ektachrome presets and boost the gamma, you can see this is a pretty extreme example and it's crunching things a lot, but you get the idea that if there's a grade on this stuff, we'll notice those highlights a bit more. I'm just going to go back to this default here. I want to give you a couple more quick things to think about. The first is check out what the transmission does when the sun totally backlights this tree. So if I swing this around until we can actually see the sun, let's bring it down to the horizon, so we're getting super orangey looks here, and then we'll just swing it around until we can see it back there. There we go, and we'll bring it up a bit, and maybe we'll boost its power a little bit so you can really see what's going on. When it backlights the leaves, we get these interesting variations in color here. The other thing I'd like to point out is the contribution from the sun gets a lot more dramatic if this floor isn't white. Like right now we're getting a ton of bounce light from the floor, so if we change the floor to more of a gray, now we're going to see that stuff show up a lot more. Same thing goes too with those glossy materials. You're going to notice them a bit more when the main contribution of light is from that single source. For instance, lighting the tree with a single small high-powered area light, you really see those glossy shaders coming through. And at this point, I'm going to check out a few other trees because we want some variation when we're putting this stuff in Octane Scatter. We don't want just the same type of tree over and over again. So let's check out some other trees real quick. All right, so let's come back up to Plugins, Forester, Forester Tree. Just grab another one. So let's come down and find some large leafy trees, like here's a live oak. Let's try that. And remember, we'll go back to tree parameters and set the viewport levels to the same as the render levels. And in this case, the leaf texture it's using is exactly the same as before. So if we look here, we can check out the image. So it's just using this as the overall leaf texture. So we can actually go ahead and replace this with the texture we put all the effort into. So let's just drop this over top here. And there we go. That's a lot nicer looking. So I can also create another version of the sun by holding down Control and duplicating, and let's just rotate this around so that we'll be able to see the glossy shaders a little bit better. So here's that version, and then this one's to check out the transmission. So as we build these, we'll be able to check out things a little bit easier. Okay, so here's a potentially faster way to swap out the trees. If I just duplicate my live oak tree here and turn the old one off, I can just come in here and go to my tree library and switch it for something else. So let's come on down and grab this regular oak tree here. And now if we come under tree parameters, you can see this one has render levels of 8. So I kind of use that as a guide to figure out where I should put my viewport levels. So I'll pop in 8 for that. And there we go. All right, let's try this cork tree here. And in this case, it looks nothing like the picture, so let's mess with the parameters here. In this case, I found 4 wasn't quite enough, so the defaults don't always work, but it's an okay guide. There we go. That's kind of a neat looking one. Let's duplicate that. All right, let's come down to this Olmesii tree. Yes, I had to look up how to pronounce that. And let's set this one to 7. Cool. And let's do one more. Maybe this one will do a smaller tree. Let's try this one out here. And let's go with the default levels on that one. Looks good. Here's a quick look at all the trees we just selected, and then if we want to check out what they look like with that transmission, there you go. So looking pretty good. Let's move on to selecting different types of grass. Alright, so this is a super helpful file that Joseph Bashara sent me that shows some different types of grass that he's using to create variation in the Forester settings. So you can see that some of them are more spread out patches and others are clumpier, and when you make sure to include that variation, overall your result's going to be more convincing. So if we come into the Forester settings on one of these, you can see that he's altered the grass patch radius. So this is just the control that spreads the patches out. So we've got some patches that are much tighter like this and others that are more spread out. So that's a really simple control, and just that one thing will pretty dramatically change the look of your grass overall. And then grass size and length are also pretty important. So we could make thinner, taller pieces of grass. And finally, let's take a look at these grass node count and grass per node counts. So what does this actually mean? Let's zoom in here and take a look. So let's bring them both down to 1. And now we've just got a single blade of grass, and as we crank this up, we're just going to have a bunch of individual blades of grass all in this circle. And they've got this fall off that kind of tapers down to nothing, and that's controlled by the grass node length ratio. So if we bring this up, you can see that once we hit 0, they're all the same height, but then as we bring this closer to 1, they fall off in terms of their height. So instead of the node count, let's bring this all the way back down. And let's do the grass per node count. So this one will just increase the number of blades of grass we've got per node, or basically little patch of grass. So then you can see as we increase the number of nodes, those are the number of minor patches within the overall patch. So we get this kind of look here. So having the distribution towards a greater grass per node count and lower grass node count kind of creates more of a digital look that has these obvious spirals in there. So I think it makes more sense to reduce this and then crank the grass node count. And then you get more of a randomized looking patch. All right, back in our scene here, let's do this ourselves so you can follow along fully. Plugins, Forester, now we want the multi-flora. And let's zoom way in here till we see this little piece of grass. Now we've also got a library here. Let's start with that same bent grass. And you can see it's not as good looking as we had in the other scene, so let's fix this up. First thing, let's handle the materials. So Forester has created a bunch of these materials, but they're not being used. So let's go to Materials, Remove Unused Materials. And then with this, we've got, again, a physical render material. So let's switch this to Octane. So we go Materials, Convert Materials, and Materials, Remove Unused. Cool, so now we can hop into the node editor. And let's take a look at this. This texture is going to be basically identical to what we did before, so let's take this, pop it into the transmission. Now we've got light passing through, and let's put in our color correction here. And take the gamma down a little bit. And that desaturates things a touch, which is also kind of good because it was looking a bit hypersaturated. Now let's duplicate this setup and put it into a mix material. Pipe these both in. And let's go back and replace our material here. So we want this mix and pop it over top of this one. Double click this if we want this to refresh. And back in here, we want this second one to be a glossy material. So let's switch this to glossy. And let's ride this slider all the way to the left so that we can only see our glossy material. And remember, we want to crank the roughness so that we can see it actually taking effect. There we go, that feels a lot waxier. Now let's do our 50% blend. And now we've got kind of a nice combined shader here. So this isn't piped into anything anymore since no transmission exists for the glossy shader. So let's lose this. And then here, we don't need this extra material. We can just take the one from here and pipe it into the diffuse. So now we're handling everything with one single texture. Okay, the last thing I'm not liking about this grass shader is the color. So if we want to alter that, we can just pop in another color correction node. So we basically want this to be just downstream of this node here, and then affecting these three pathways as well. So we just want to replace all these. So let's pop it in here into this diffuse, into this texture here, and then into this diffuse. And then finally, let's pull this into the texture here. And it should look the same because we haven't actually done anything. So this one will be our color correction, and this one's the little gamma boost that's bringing a little bit more light into those blades, if you remember. So let's take this and let's mess with the hue a little bit. And you can see this is already looking a lot more natural. I was having issues earlier where this wasn't actually changing until I refreshed, so just watch out for that. It might not actually change color until you do that. And now let's just dial in the Forester settings a bit more. Let's go to our grass and boost the node count. And then let's increase the patch radius a little bit here. And maybe we can mess with this grass node offset a little bit, which kind of randomizes things. We can also randomize the grass length. We can play a little bit with the turbulence of the grass. And finally, this grass per node length ratio. Let's bring this all the way up. Cool, let's just duplicate this and change the settings a bit. Scooch this one over so we can see what's going on. Maybe up the count. And we can make this one a little bit patchier. So let's maybe increase the grass size a little bit and then decrease the patch radius to make it a bit tighter. Cool, let's duplicate this one more time. Let's scooch this one over this way again. And this time let's try a totally different type of grass. Let's go in and grab some wild grass and see what that looks like. And that should be cool. And then let's go and spread this one out a bit. And here's another issue you might run into. If we duplicate this out and you want to throw something like a flower in there, say we go to one of these guys here, you can see that none of the textures come in, and that's because it's got a totally different set of textures. So let's try to start fresh with Forester Multiflora. Bring this over. And if we come down to a flower, you're going to see we're still having the same issue where it's found one of the textures, but the others are just missing. So that's probably from earlier when we removed those unused gray textures, if you remember. So the quick fix to this is just to start a new scene. So let's just hit Control N and then go grab another Forester Multiflora. And here, if we grab something like those same flowers, now you'll see that all the textures load in correctly. So then you could just copy this, go back to your other scene, and paste. And now if you want, you can replace those grass textures. Cool, so that's the idea, but I'm going to be boring and just stick with grass for now. All right, here's where things start to get fun. So just as a way to demo this quicker, I'm going to put down a landscape, and I'll scale that up to some larger scale of some sort. That should be fine. And then let's get rid of our floor. And all we need at this point is an Octane scatter. So right here, or under Objects, Octane scatter. And now let's put our three little patches of grass in there and tell the Octane scatter to scatter on the surface of this landscape. Cool, so now I'm getting all these little patches. Doesn't look like much until I up the count to, let's try 10,000. Still looking patchy and weird. Let's go 100,000. Okay, we're getting there. Let's just go right up to 1,000,000. It's gonna take a little bit longer to load, but not too bad. Cool, so I'm going to move on in here so we can check things out a little bit closer. So if we look closely, it feels like there are these weird ripples or patterns that are not natural looking. And that has to do with the fact that all of these patches of grass are oriented the same way. So we want to just put in a simple random effector to change the rotation of all those patches of grass. So let's go to MoGraph effector random. And unlike the cloner, it doesn't automatically add it to the scatter. So you got to come into the effectors here and actually place it in there. And now things have all jumped out of whack. So that actually looks kind of interesting. A little bit of that might be good. So let's go 11, 11, 11, just to displace things a little bit. But we're jumping ahead of ourselves because we're trying to remove that artifacting. So let's turn this off for a second. Okay, and let's go to the rotation. And then H is the value that we want. So let's just type in 360 for a full rotation there. So here's the before and after. Here we've got those digital looking patterns. And here things are a lot more evened out and randomized. And let's bring this up so that we can see the grass a little bit better. So if you want to make the default Windows XP desktop, congratulations, we just did it. All right, so the next thing that I think could really use some work is this is all just one solid color. And so let me show you how to introduce some more color variation. We can go back to our grass shader here. So I'm going to show you a couple ways we can do this. Both of them involve this random color shader, so let's drag this down. And the next one we want is a mix texture. All right, so let's take this and pipe it into texture 1, and then take the output of this and pipe it into our color correction node. And for now, let's just pop a float texture in to texture 2. So much like a mixed material, we get this blend slider, and on one side we should see our original, but sometimes things get a little haywire and you need to reload. So I'm getting all this white in there even when I'm on 0 for the amount, so let's reload. So there we go. So that's just kind of a bit of a bug to be aware of. So it should be that on amount 0 we're only using this, and on amount 1 we're only using the float texture. So if we go to amount 1, we'll see we've just got a gray 50% float texture in there. So instead of the float texture, let's just drag in this random color so we can see what's going on with the random color. Okay, there we go. So now we're getting different values of black and white for each instance in Octane Scatter. So this is really cool. So now if we drop in a gradient, we can remap these values of black and white to a couple different colors. So what if we chose 2 different shades of green? So let's try this one, and then we'll do a darker shade of green. So something like that. And again, I had to reload to see exactly what I was expecting. So now I should be able to blend between what we had before, which is this. And if we just introduce a little bit of that random, we're getting a little bit more interesting color variations. One thing I want to point out though is if we zoom all the way up on this, say we go all the way in towards a blade of grass, if we blend all the way to the right here, you'll notice that we're blending in a solid color. So we've lost all texture. So this might not be the ideal solution. You're probably never going to see it from way back there, but there's a bit better of a way to set this up. So let's jump back out here. Okay, so instead of putting the random color shader and gradient here, let's disconnect this. And let's actually use the random color node for the amount. And then we can duplicate this texture and pipe it into texture 2, and we should be back to square one because it's just randomly selecting between these two, which are currently the same. But if we alter one of these, say we put in a color correction node between here and here, let's pop this in, and say we kind of pull the hue this away and maybe change the gamma, you can see that maybe we've introduced a bit more of a subtle variation, and we haven't actually lost any of the texture of these individual blades of grass. Okay, but going back to this previous setup real quick, I want to show you how this can create some more abstract and wacky results. So if we pull in a gradient, nothing should change, but rather than just using 2 colors, we can try a bunch of different colors. So let's just go crazy here, make something truly awful. Okay, and I've been having this issue a lot where I need to refresh. So there we go, that's disgusting. Let's try one of these presets instead. And reload. That's more like it. Also, instead of the gradient, another super fun node is the Gaussian spectrum. So let's just drop that in there instead. And I'm going to reload. And now let's bring this width down to a really low value. Alright, now we got confetti grass. So the lower you bring this width, the more saturated the colors are going to get. Though at some point it also looks like they get a bit darker, so that would require boosting things a bit more. So to compensate for that, you could put a color correction in there and boost the brightness. Beautiful. Okay, now I'm being serious this time though. Back to the other setup. Let's art direct this until it looks a little more natural. So let's pull in a color correction node here again. And so these are going to be the patches of grass that are a little more dried out and dead looking. So for this, we obviously want to desaturate. And then I think if we pull the gamma up, that we'll get a lighter color. So you can see what's going on here. And then we'll also want to shift the hue more towards an orange. So let's go pretty far. Keep on going. Cool, that's kind of the look I'm going for. And then to contrast that, maybe I'll make the other color a little more saturated so it really stands out. So let's just drag in another color correction node. And then this one we can just saturate a bit and maybe darken this down. And let's really crank the saturation actually. Let's go up to like 2 and let's maybe shift it a little more back to yellow. And so I kind of like this true green, but maybe I want it a little more back to that yellowy green. Cool, I think I'm happy with that. But keep in mind that this stuff will get greatly enhanced depending on the color profile you're using. So if I drop in my favorite ectochrome here and change it to a neutral response, and then maybe put a little bit of yellowy green into the white balance to kind of compensate against that cast that's going on. And then maybe boost the gamma, boost the exposure. And I tweaked these colors a bit more here, but you can see just how emphasized this can get with your color grading and with your materials combined. So you often want to be viewing through your color profiles so you can make decisions about your materials in context. Alright, so obviously I've been waffling back and forth between these two techniques, but I landed on the first one because it allowed me to create a more complex gradient, and I wanted to reduce the number of dead patches of grass and have it be more green overall. Now the other thing I'd like to do is change the grass patch radius on some of these and see if we can get some different looks. So say we came to this bent grass 1 and we decreased its patch radius down to something like 0.8, and then we like upped its length here, and we could also come to the multiflora global and increase its size to like 1.5. And now we're getting a pretty different look with clumpier and maybe more wild looking grass. I don't necessarily like this as much, so I'm going to go back, but you get the idea how just changing these parameters a little bit will dramatically alter the look of your field. Alright, last but not least, the lighting is going to super dramatically change this entire picture. So I'm going to bring this down so I can see a bit better, and then I'm going to pan the camera upwards so that we're catching that horizon. Also, I just realized I never turned back on the position parameter in the random effector, so that's going to bring a little bit more visual interest in too. But back to the sun here, so let's just rotate it downwards until I see some orange coming in so that I know that it's getting close to sunset. So maybe like right around there. And once it's at the height that I want, a lot of the time I like to come over to north offset, which just works in one axis, and I can be sure that I'm just rotating it around 360 and not affecting its height. So I'll leave it somewhere around here and let the image refine for a bit. And now you can really see those glossy shaders at work. And at this point the grass is feeling almost purplish in certain spots. So for that you could just decrease the saturation of those areas and shift them a bit back towards green. And there we go, that's feeling a little bit more natural. And I just swung the sunlight around even more and got this result that really accentuates the highlights on the grass blades even more. Alright, so what if we wanted to break up this grass a bit more and have patches of rock showing through, and maybe even carve a path through the scene to lead the eye? So how would we go about doing that? Okay, I'm going to pause the render. The first thing I'm going to show you is this little technique with Vertex Maps in Octane Scatter. Okay, so I'm going to cut off Octane Scatter, and then with my landscape object, I'm going to set the width and depth segments to 1,000 each, so we max out the geometry on this and we get a lot more detail, and this will help us with painting the vertex map. So I'm going to hit C to make it editable, and now I'm just going to create a polygon selection of where I want this path to go. So say it goes around like that, and maybe we have one section that comes this way and branches off and goes down that way. Okay? Now, it's probably not a good idea to paint from perspective, because then things widen out the further away they get, and it's kind of like a projection issue, but I don't really care that much. I'll just fill in these holes from the top and kind of fix this up a little bit. And we can make a bigger brush like this, and we can just pretend that it happens to be a much wider path down this way. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay, now I'm going to invert the selection with UI, and I'm going to hit Shift C and say set vertex weight, and I'm going to set the vertex weight to 100%. So now we've got our vertex map, and you can see if we click off it, we don't see it, but when we click on this vertex tag here, we have the ability to continue painting. So if we want to thicken this up, we can just double click and it'll bring out our paint tool, and anything that's red is going to be subtracted. So that's a vertex weight of 0, and you can see it's a little bit slow because I've got such heavy geometry right now, but it'll work. And I'll just continue to paint along here. And there we go. So if you click normally, you'll paint with yellow, which is 100%, and if you hold down Control, you'll paint with red, which is 0. Cool, so that's our vertex tag. Now if we go back to the scatter here, all we have to do is drag in our vertex map into this vertex map field, and you can see magically we've got this path carved. Now if we want to define it even further, there's this little twirl down here, and you can set the limit to 1 or anywhere in between, and it'll just kind of widen things out for you. So let's fire this back up and see what happens. Awesome, and that looks pretty organic and nice and broken up. Okay, now at this point, what if we want to add in some additional variation that isn't connected to this path here? We can go into our Octane scatter, and under the distribution here, we can just add in a noise. And I'm going to jump into the noise, and then I'm going to go down to electric. Though any noise type will work, and it's definitely fun to experiment with different noise types and see what kind of patterns you get in your grass. And then I want to just use the high and low clip a little bit to crunch this in, and then I'll jump up one, and nothing's going to happen until this min slider is pulled up on. So this is actually going to cull the instances based on this noise. Okay, and you can see that's way too much. And the other thing right now is that this noise is super huge, so we're going to get these massive patches, and maybe we want that, but let's start with smaller patches. So let's take this noise down to, say, 15%. Okay, and now it feels like we've lost the path entirely, so that's not exactly what we want either. So let's pull down on this low clip and keep going with this look. That's more what I'm looking for, is just these little holes there. Now we can also go up one and put this into a layer shader. So say we go down to layer here, and now when we jump into this noise, we'll have the ability to add additional textures or additional shaders. So we can just drop in another noise shader here. And this one's going to sit on top, so it's just like any layer system like After Effects or Photoshop. And this one, maybe we try another noise. Let's try Luca. And we'll crunch this down. Cool, and so now we've got some bigger patches, but we want to combine those with the smaller ones. But I'm going to set my small noise on top here. So this one's going to override the previous one. And I could use blend modes like multiply, screen overlay, etc. But in this case, I think I just want to blend back the opacity. So as I take this back, some of these will be smaller and some of them will be larger, showing through from the bottom. So I'm liking this look and I'm going to stick with it. Okay, the next obvious question is, how do we replace this white stuff with something that looks good, some realistic looking ground texture, some rocks and stuff like that? Okay, and here's the secret sauce. This is rdtextures.com, which stands for Real Displacement Textures. If you scroll down here, you get this little description that says these are actual full 3D scans of environments that are fully seamless and tileable, and they work as displacement maps in whatever rendering software you want. So these are extremely useful and totally aid realism when you're working in natural environments. So if we go to the shop here, and then click collection, there's a bunch of different packs and collections you can get that have better value as a bundle. One of my favorite ones here under pack is called Quarry. So let's look at that real quick. And this pack is 59 euros. You can also buy textures individually, but nothing really beats the realism of this. So I'm going to use this rock texture here and this soil texture. And for those of you that are on a bit more of a budget, check out polygon.com. I'm sure I've mentioned them before, but they've just started hosting actual scan textures. So if you look down here, you'll see photo scanned. These are legit, same kind of displacement textures. So very similar idea, super high res up to 6K textures. I think this one here would be a great candidate for that ground. There's also some forest paths that would be super useful. Mossy ground. And this forest soil looks really good, as does this clay. So let's cut off our Octane scatter here. So I'm going to open up a new scene real quick and show you what the deal is with these. So let's go File New. And I'm going to navigate to my Quarry pack here. And let's look at Soil 12. So really nice, they actually set up Octane project files for you already, so you don't have to go to the trouble of loading in all the textures. So we can just come in here and hit render, and it should be all ready to go. So there you go, there's our photo scanned, sweet looking rocks there, super detailed, and insanely fast to load and mess around with. Now if we navigate to the node editor, we can see what's going on a bit better. And the main thing you're going to want to modify is this displacement here, depending on how you scale the texture. Right now it's scaled for the height that it really was when they did the photo scan. So if you mess with this, you're going to break the reality of it. Like you can see here, this doesn't look as realistic. But if we're scaling this texture up and down, for instance, it's going to change how the displacement's reacting. And when it's larger, we're not going to see as much displacement. So we're going to have to compensate for that. So we'll just eyeball it here. Let's go around 200. And this is close to where it was before. So you get the idea. Okay, so I brought in a couple of displacement textures here, and now we can check these out. So let's just take this one that we saw before, the soil one, and drop it on this landscape. And we're seeing it come through, but the displacement is totally off. And also this blue is distracting me, so I'm going to switch my sun here and just change the sky color and desaturate it. There we go. So let's double click our material here and jump into the displacement. And let's just crank it to 1350. Cool, that's looking a lot more appropriate. We might want to make it a little bit smaller. I feel like this is a little bit too big for the displacement. So let's go in here and just change this to something like 25 by 25. Okay, and now the displacement height is way too high. So let's go down to 650, though it kind of looks cool in a weird Martian sort of way. Okay, cool, so that's looking pretty sweet to me. So let's see how this is working with our Octane scatter. So let's turn that back on and turn back on our patches of grass. Cool, so this is already looking great. One control that can help a lot is just under displacement, there's this mid-level. And so this controls basically whether the displacement is displacing out or inwards. So you can see if we mess with this here, say we take it down, that brought the rocks way, way closer. So obviously not what we want. And then if we bring it up, now the rocks are a little bit lower. If we kept going, we'd see them kind of fully disappear at some point. So I'm just going to stick with 0.5. And by that I mean what we had before, which was obviously like 0.6, though this is a cool look too. Okay, I'm going to turn off the grass again. Now, one thing that can sell this even more, not that we're seeing repetitions, but if we had a much smaller version of this texture, we would. But a lot of the time it can help to combine multiple displacements, and I'll show you what I mean. I can just duplicate this landscape, and in the second one, I'll drag this other texture I've got here, which is a different set of rocks and not as brown and soily as this. And I'll turn off the top one so we can see what's going on. Cool, so this is a different look. And in this case, I think I'm actually going to scale it up to 50 by 50 because I'm going to go for these bigger stone slabs for this one. And then I'll jump in here and maybe increase the displacement to something like 750. Cool, so now let's see what happens when we combine it with the other displacement. This is a great way of adding additional details. And rocks like this that are looking kind of low res, they're just going to get covered up anyway by the vegetation, so I'm not too worried about it. So let's pop these back on. So now we've got these interesting stones buried in the grass. And if you want to do something like this without displacement textures, you can also use the Forester rock here and scatter this as well. Alright, that's it for part 1. In part 2, we're going to be adding those trees and finally exploring how to create God rays, as well as adding in HDRIs and dealing with larger scale scenes for some aerial views, and finally looking at a new feature that allows you to add some custom LUTs into the camera imager to really enhance the natural colors and create a ton of interesting variation. See you in part 2.